All right, welcome everybody to another Belmont Plateau Hall of Fame show. As you know, we're still waiting to hear about our Hall of Fame race, August 29th. That all depends on the city of Philadelphia, awarding permits and so forth. So we'll in the next couple of days what's going on with that, and I'll let you guys know. Obviously, details are on our website, so you go to our website at Belmont Plateau, cchof.com, for any updates. Keeping it with our mission, we have interviews roughly every week or every 2 weeks with Hall of Famers and people who have some insight or some background with the city of Philadelphia and the history of our distance running. So we have a long history of distance running in Philadelphia, and I like to bring on guests that will kind of give us some background on that and with Belmont Plateau. So this week we have a special guest, Joe Ryan, and just going to give a little background on Joe. I can probably go on 15 minutes just on his background of everything he's done in the past 60 years here. But just kind of briefly, Joe was born in Philly and went to Cardinal Dougherty High School, and then from there went on to the Salle College, where he had a pretty good career. In the Catholic League, he was a Catholic League champion in 2 mile, and was also an all-Catholic in cross country. And at LaSalle is where he really started to shine. He had records for LaSalle College as far as in the steeplechase. He had a school record in the steeple, and you can correct me on some of this stuff, Joe. The 2 mile, the 3 mile. He was also for LaSalle, was in 3 NCAA championships for cross country. And then after college, he went on to compete a couple of years for the Florida Track Club and ran with some great pass runners like Frank Shorter, Martin McQuarrie, so we could talk a little bit about that. And then after that was his longest career, where he became a teacher and then became a long-time official, race promoter, race director, and then coach at Phila Textile for 14 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about the whole history here, so I don't want to hold you up anymore. So Joe, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
And, we'll talk a little bit more about everything with Philadelphia and distance running and about your career here in Philly. So first of all, a little bit about your background. I just kind of touched on a few highlights. But, if you want to just talk to everybody out here, what it was like growing up in the 60s and, before the actual running boom, and what it was like kind of running in the streets of Philadelphia and, getting to running cross country.
Yeah, you're right there. It was definitely before the what they referred to as the jogging boom took off. And we did run mostly in the streets. I grew up in East Germantown in Philly, went to Cardinal Dougherty. I ran 4 years at Dougherty, ran on 3 Catholic League and City Championship teams. Had a great coach, as you well know, Jack Saint Clair, who was your coach at Temple. And I went to LaSalle on a full scholarship, ran track and cross country for 4 years at LaSalle. Back in those days, freshmen could not run varsity, so you had to run in your freshman events. Like there was an MAC conference, and the IC4A had a freshman race. And then I was 3 years varsity at LaSalle. I was the #1 runner on the team for 3 full years. We won a conference title my sophomore year under Frank Wetzler. He was our coach, and Mr. Paul Minahan, another former Cardinal Dougherty in LaSalle, great runner. He was our assistant coach. So I had some good times. I was in, I guess we'll talk a little bit more about Belmont Plateau in a little bit. And I spent a couple of years as an accountant and then decided to try running again, went to the University of Florida, took some graduate classes prior to the 72 Olympic trials. And the people that were there were just incredible. With Frank Shorter and Jack Batchelor and Kenny Meisner and Jeff Galloway and Barry Brown. And then Marty LaCourie came down later with Dick Berkeley, who has just recently passed away, as you know. It was just a great place to be. It was another whole world compared to what we did in Philly in the 60s, when we were running 50, 60 miles a week and we thought we were distance runners. Went down there and we were running 120 miles a week. So it was a rude awakening, but it also put me in a position where I did a lot of work with the Florida Track Club and Coach Jimmy Carnes, who was the Olympic team coach in 1980 when we didn't go to Moscow. But administratively, I learned a lot down there administratively, working with the Florida Relays and some other invitationals and things along those lines. So that was a great situation. Came back to Philly, started teaching at Archbishop Ryan, stayed at Ryan 41 years. I helped Ed Ulmer for 2 years with the Ryan boys teams. We won the school's first championships in cross country in the fall of '73. And then in 1975, as you mentioned, I was hired. It was then called the Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science as the head cross country, and started indoor and outdoor track. The school had not had those programs since like 1918. And we did a lot of good things there. I had some really good teams. I had some great athletes. Took a lot of guys to nationals. Started the women's team 10 years later. And it really blossomed. It was a great place to be, a great place to coach. And as you well know, I'm going to be inducted into the what is now the Jefferson University Hall of Fame, hopefully this October. It was supposed to be last May, canceled for obvious reasons, and we're hoping to get it done this year at homecoming. So I know you'll be there. I'm hoping you can present me.
Well, going back, I just want to get back to Philly a lot, where we were both coached by a Hall of Fame, legendary Coach Jack Saint Clair.
No doubt.
Quite a character in his day.
Oh.
So can you give us any crazy stories with Saint or?
Well, yeah, but I don't think you want to tape this for an hour and a half. But yeah, but we'll do some. Saint was years before his time. The guys out in Oregon, Dillinger and all those guys, they got so much credit for fartlek and ins and outs. And St. Clair was doing that years before all those guys. And all the great runners that ran at Dougherty, even, ahead of me, the Frank Carvers and Billy Clarks and Mike Coffees and Harold Spiro and Paul Minahan and Pete Dougherty and Tom Kelly. I mean, there's so many Catholic League champions, city champions, many of which went on and ran at schools like Notre Dame and LaSalle and St. Joe's, like Larry Bolger ran for St. Joe's. We knew as we got older that Saint was doing things training-wise that nobody really was doing. And I never felt he got the credit for that. He didn't write any books. He wasn't involved with Oregon and Nike and all that stuff. But Saint was a hustler, as you know. You had to run well, and even sometimes when you didn't run well, he made you feel like you didn't run well. But, we loved him in his own special way. He had a great wife, Jeannie, and bunch of kids, 12, I think, to be exact. And it was a great time. And we did whatever we had to do. Now, an interesting story, and we talk about the plateau, and I know how much that's in your heart. My senior year at Cardinal Dougherty, Saint was hired. He was already the assistant track and field coach at Temple, and he got hired to be the head cross-country coach. So my senior year, our top guys, the top 7 or 8 of us, we would go every day from Dougherty to 33rd and Dauphin. Just a little history, the Catholic League and the Public League, everybody ran on the course at 33rd and Dauphin. It was 2.3 miles. It had one hill after the half-mile pole, which the Catholic League ran up, but the Public League went the other way around the reservoir and actually ran down. And at that point in time, all the high schools ran at 33rd and Dauphin. The colleges had just started to run at Belmont Plateau. I think St. Joe's and Villanova still ran out at Cobb's Creek. But the city schools, Penn and Temple, and later on, I think St. Joe's and LaSalle, and Penn were running at Belmont. There were different courses, though, Dave, at that time. Like each school had their own little layout. And then in the early 60s, I think St. Clair and Jim Tuppeny, who had just come over to Penn from Villanova, and Luna Castro, I believe, was still at St. Joe's. They all got together and said, look, let's lay out a decent course here. And the course they laid out, as you well know, probably better than anybody, became one of the most difficult cross-country courses in the entire country. Front hill twice and parachute and short hill and nursery, and it was a great course. But that's really where that came about. But back to my story, when I was a senior, we used to ride down to 33rd and Dauphin. Temple actually had a locker room on the course at 33rd and Dauphin. And then we would jog over the bridge to Belmont. And that was the first time I had ever run at Belmont Plateau for practice, because that's where the Temple team trained. And so did Penn. And later on, so did St. Joe's. And then, I guess Drexel still had a team then. I don't remember. But that was my beginning of Belmont Plateau. I was a senior in high school, so that would have been cross country 1964. But we were still racing at 33rd and Dauphin until there was an incident with the North Catholic team. Their bus got attacked and some kids were cut with razor blades. And the Catholic League said, that's it. We're not running there anymore. So the rest of my senior season, we actually ran at home meets. We ran at Dougherty. North Catholic ran at Juniata Golf Club. And then the championships were 33rd and Dauphin. Tommy Donnelly won again 3 times in a row. Probably the greatest cross-country runner in Catholic League history, if not city history. I was second, and our team won the championship again. We won all 3 of my years at Dougherty. And I think at one point they won like 7 out of 8 in a row. And then the next week was the public league. And so the city meet was at 33rd and Dauphin. And then after that, the Catholic League started to run at Belmont. The first high school race that I recall at Belmont Plateau was the Catholic War Veterans Race. And it was my senior year, 1964. Saint Clair, pretty much by himself, maybe with some help from some others, laid out a 2.5-mile course, way different than what we have now. Started down by the road, went up the hill, around the flagpole, went around, went into the woods, went up parachute, down parachute, came back out, went around the hut, and finished where the current starting line is. And I believe that was the first high school race ever held at Belmont Plateau. And then Tommy Donnelly won. I was second. And a guy from Pittsburgh Central Catholic who became a teammate of mine, Hank Jeswali, he actually went by me in the chute. And they gave him second place, and I wasn't happy, and St. Clair went crazy, but they didn't change it, so I officially got third. But that was the first time, Dave, I believe, that the high schools ran at Belmont. And then the Catholic League, the following season, ran all their meets at Belmont Plateau. The Public League stayed at 33rd and Dauphin, and the city championship meets alternated. So one year it was at 33rd, and then next year was at Belmont. And then finally, a few years later, the Public League came over too. But the Catholic League, or the colleges, I should say, had been running there prior to that. I can clearly remember November 22nd, 1963, the day that John F. Kennedy was killed. Paul Moynihan won the Mid-Atlantic Conference University Division championship meet in LaSalle, won the team title. And there was a picture in the bulletin of the flagpole, our infamous flagpole, as you well know. And the flag was at half staff. And tremendous picture of Paul in the final loop running by the flagpole. And the caption said, Paul Moynihan of LaSalle wins the MAC under these conditions. And so, but we were there. Joe Conley and Kevin O'Rourke and I rode down with Father Nevins, who was our cross-country moderator at Cardinal Dougherty, to watch the Dougherty grads run. As they say, there was a lot of LaSalle guys. Pete Dock and Tommy Kelly was at Temple, and Larry Bolger was at St. Joe's, and we had Dougherty grads everywhere. So the colleges were running there in the earlier 60s, prior to the high schools coming over, like I said, in 64, 65. And the course was a lot different. You probably remember a little bit before the buildings were built, there used to be a road right across what is now the front loop. It went from the parking lot all the way around. They took that out, and we used to go further to the right on the bottom loop, and way over to the right, the mile marker was actually right where you went into the woods. In fact, there's an old blue pole, David, still there. I'm sure you've seen it. So it's changed, and it's definitely changed for the better. And then, of course, what you have done, and I sing your praises all the time, what you have done down there in the last 5, 6, 8, 10 years, I can't even recall, has been incredible.
We're trying to make it more professional kind of looking, and
no question. And we were never even sure how accurate it was. We used to call it the high school course 3 miles, but it was really like 2.9 something. But what you've done there is fabulous. And as you know, when I was coaching, I was able to host a number of invitational meets. I had the largest high school invitational in the state, the Textile Scholastic Classic. We hosted a college invitational. I had the regionals twice that you just had last year, the NCAA's Mid-Atlantic Conference meets. And the teams in Division II that were like nationally ranked, the Millersvilles, Shippensburgs, and Edinburghs, they would say, there's not a course in the country that's anywhere that tougher than this, especially when we went to 6 miles before we went to meters. and they would go to nationals, and our region would go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 in nationals. And they all said, anytime the meets at Belmont Plateau, running on somebody's golf course in California, it's like a pleasure. But
Well,
you know, the
last
history.
year, the guy who won Kenyon, who won the regionals here at Belmont last year in
Yep.
2019, went on to win
Yep.
the national title
Yep.
2020 or 2019. So that was good to see. Belmont's reputation kind of keeps up.
Absolutely. And you know, like, as you know, not only locally, but a lot of Olympians ran in some of those meets. When the one year I hosted Mount St. Mary's, before they went Division I, they were in our group, and they had the 3 Kenyans who won medals in the Olympic Games and ran in that race. Yeah, it's got a great history, and I talk to people all the time. I know you do. Van Cortlandt Park's probably got an older reputation, you know, IC4As and the HEPs and Manhattan meet and the Fordham meet and 1,000 high schools run there. Franklin Park in Boston is always mentioned. But I'll tell you, people sing the praises of Belmont Plateau. If a kid can run cross country at Belmont, they can run anywhere. That's to me one of the toughest courses in the country.
Now, you talked about Olympians and national people. 1976 brought the national AAU National Championship here to Philadelphia.
Yep.
And I know you were involved with that. So just tell us about that race. Rick Rojas went on to win it.
Right.
The record was set a few weeks previous by Paul Stemmer, and then all the great guys came in. So tell us who was in that race and your involvement with the race and how it came to Philadelphia. Like, why was Philadelphia chose, obviously with the Bicentennial, but who drafted that to get it here?
The city did try that year with the Bicentennial to have so many events. I hosted the Mid-Atlantic Conference Championships that year. That was, back then we were still university division and college division, NCAA. There was no division 1, 2, 3. But the university division of the MAC had left and formed the East Coast Conference. That was LaSalle and St. Joe and Temple and Drexel and Bucknell and Lafayette, Lehigh, all those schools. But I hosted the MAC as part of the Bicentennial. And then I was asked to help with the national AAU, and Mr. Saint Clair, needless to say, was very, very involved, as were a lot of city officials and things. And, you know, our viewpoint was, you know, it was a cross-country championship, a national championship with national ramifications. And we wanted it to be right. You know, city people can sit behind a desk and say, we need to do this, need that. So you don't understand. We're cross-country people. So I always gave more of the credit to Saint than myself. There were others involved. I think Kevin Quinn was also involved back in that time. As an administrator, and you know this, sometimes you're so worried about everything going right, you don't even remember who ran and who won until you read it in the paper the next day. But I remember Rick winning, and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought we got nice coverage in Sports Illustrated. Was that the same year?
Sports Illustrated did a nice article, feature article on that race.
Yes.
They actually had a picture of Rojas ahead of a great Terry Cotton, and Jeff Bradley was third. So nice coverage, which you don't get anymore in Sports Illustrated. So
exactly, to get anything in cross country in Sports Illustrated is unbelievable. One interesting thing, though, if you think back on it, and this just popped into my head, there were no women runners. Think about that. There was no the colleges, to the best of my knowledge, didn't have women. The AAU, we didn't have women in the championships. You know, it wasn't until much later than that. And obviously you see the boom now. Our women's team nationally and regionally are so good. But there was no high school girls cross country that I can recall. When I went to LaSalle and at the time St. Joe's, and just prior to that Villanova, they were all men's schools. There were no women's teams. So think back to that race. It's 1976. I mean, it's a while ago now. But there was no women's division. And I can't even remember, you might know better than I, when the women first started.
I believe it was in the 70s.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing is, if you look at the amount of teams now for NCAA, there's actually more women's teams competing in cross country than there are men's teams.
Yeah. Oh, no question.
So
no question. Yep. I agree.
I want to skip, with the time we have, I want to kind of skip away from cross and keep it with distance running. Now, I know you were involved with the, we used to have a great indoor track circuit here in the country. with
Yep.
the Spectrum and Inquire Games and all that being part of it. And we had some great distance runners here for that meet. And I know you were heavily involved with that. And it's no
Yep.
longer around anymore, which is a shame. So just kind of tell everyone about that whole era.
Dave, I think the main difference was not only indoor and outdoor track, but just to go back to a minute in cross country. When I ran, and maybe even when you were at Temple, we had a full dual meet schedule. You know, we ran Villanova in a dual meet. We ran St. Joe's. We ran Temple. The last race that my coach, Frank Wetzler, ever saw was against Temple at Belmont Plateau. I broke the school record and beat Jack Schilling. There weren't the invitationals like happened later on, and first in cross country, where, you know, we had a full dual meet schedule, you know, and then you ran the conference meet and you ran the IC4As, and then there was an NCAA college division race and an NCAA university division race, which Villanova won all 3 of my years. Indoor track was way different. First of all, there were no rubber tracks. Everything were boards, and all the schools had board tracks. Villanova had one, St. Joe's had one, Temple had one, and LaSalle, we picked up somebody's old one, somebody bought a new one, and we got their old one. 11 lap to a mile. The old boards were like 4 inches wide, and that's what we practiced on outside. You know, nobody had an indoor building for track. That was just like not heard of. So the meets that you ran in, even to go back to when I was in high school, and the Coaches Association was started, the Philadelphia, you know, the PF Track and Field Coach Association. We ran anywhere we could. You know, whoever had a meet at Temple or Penn had the spike shoe meet, which was, you know, forever and ever, but it was run in the middle of Franklin Field, which was grass at the time, on an 11-lap board track. We ran a meet in the Armory by Drexel. But the big one was the one at the the Convention Hall, not the Civic Center, where they had a whole week of indoor meets that the City Department of Recreation hosted. There were high school meets. There was AAU, the Middle Atlantic AAUs were there. Just age group, you name it, they had it. I remember, I guess I was coaching. Carl Lewis won the long jump one year when he was at Willingboro. We were afraid he was going to hit his head on the rafters in the old Civic Center. But the big indoor meets, first the Inquire Games, they were at Convention Hall, right over top of where the basketball court was, and they couldn't get an 11-lap track, so they ran a 12-lap. And I remember Wilson Wigwa from Kenya ran the first sub-4-minute mile on a 12-lap track in the Inquire Games. All the athletes had to sit up on the stage. All the high school, college, you know, the superstars, we all sat up on the stage until your event was called. And then that meet blossomed into the Philly Track Classic, which was at the Spectrum. That was the first colored track. It was blue with white lines. And that was a very, very good meet. And they tried to always back it up with the Milrose Games, which were in Madison Square Garden. So one year our meet would be on a Friday, and or Milrose would be Friday, and the Philly meet would be Saturday. So the international stars that came in, you know, could run in both meets. And they all did back then. And then there were meets in the Boston Garden. There were meets, the Baltimore Sun was the newspaper. There was a meet down in Baltimore. We ran in Boston. And these are, again, all on the old board tracks. And, you know, obviously the Garden with the Milrose Games, and, you know, they were the best known one. And then the IC4As were in the Garden on the boards, because, you know, like I say, you know, Princeton didn't have their building yet, and those didn't come out, you know, until much later on. But again, that was the season. And then outdoor track back then, we also had full dual meet seasons. I mean, we ran a meet either during the week or on Saturday. Every single, I remember we had dual meets against Rutgers. We ran Temple. We ran St. Joe's. You know, whoever, that was your schedule. And then you had we had the Quantico relays, the Penn relays, and your conference meet, and then the IC4As. That was your season. Since then, I think everything has gone more to invitationals and qualifying standards. See, back in those days, if you could run and your coach entered you, you could run. I mean, there weren't printed standards. Like when I was coaching, I was on the advisory board for the IC4As for years, where you had to verify marks. If you know, coach said this kid ran 48 2 and the 400, they had to verify that. Back when I ran, that was not the case. If you were good enough in your coach energy, you could go. But I think because of the qualifying standards, they got away from dual meets. Plus, there weren't as many bodies. Teams that had 40 and 50 people on them back in the day were down to teams of 15 and 20, but they were all good. They were recruited athletes, very few walk-ons. And they went more to, I need to get my miler qualified, so I need to take him to Princeton. I need to take him to this meet or that meet. And that it sort of hurt the sport in a way. Southern Cal and UCLA, I think, were the last traditionalists that kept trying to keep their dual meet. And needless to say, they have world-class athletes on almost every event. But that kind of went by the wayside. So in the springtime now, it was more, invitationals, get your kids qualified. And, you kind of saw the same thing in cross country where coaches came to the realization that we don't have to race every week. The kids need to rest more. When I ran, that was, you didn't rest at all. You ran if you had a meet on Wednesday and another meet on Saturday and you trained in between. But I think the coaches came to the realization that it wasn't necessary to run 7 or 8 cross-country meets before your big meets. And kind of the same thing in track. Like, the coaches are resting their best people, especially if you get your kids qualified for, your regional meet or Division II or Division III, Division I, whatever it might be now. I think that's the biggest change in our sport. It's still a team sport made up of individual performances, but, they don't go to meets anymore where there's a team score other than the conference championships.
With a little bit of time we have left, I just want to say, what's your greatest memory? I can talk for hours with you. We haven't even touched on your involvement with the Penn Relays or, any other stuff. So, as we end, our last question kind of be, with your long history, what's your, biggest memory you have of like the greatest event or that you've seen at Philadelphia distance running or your big?
Wow. That's a tough one. If I broke it into 3 categories, first as a runner, high school, I was city champion in 64. Tommy Donnelly obviously was Catholic League champion, but we won a team title. And then I broke the Catholic League record in the 2-mile outdoors as a senior. So they were highlights. I was also state Catholic champion and meet champions champion. In college, especially in cross country, I was MAC champion as a freshman, 3 times all conference, 3 times, what we called then college division. Broke a lot of the school, good school, Paul Minahan and Pete Doc's records at Belmont and at Van Cortlandt, and a lot of course records. They were all highlights. We won some team titles, and that was great. As a coach, we won some championships, as you know, when I was the coach at Textile at the time, and took a lot of guys to nationals, made a lot of guys All-Americans. And as an official, I've been at every Penn Relay since 1961, except for this year. Hope to continue that. And I've been an official coming up on about 50. But I also, when I was coaching at Textile, I was on all the NCAA championships committees, nationals, indoors, outdoor, cross country. And I got into the administrative side of it, and then I stayed into the officiating side of it. And now, as you know, I do a lot of assigning of officials in cross country and indoor and outdoor track and field. And that probably is a general highlight. I've seen so many great races. I know you'll remember the Dream Mile down at Penn when Marty beat Jim Ryan, and I was a Jim Ryan fan because of his name, even though my father always said he spelled it wrong with a U instead of an A. But I got to know Marty pretty good when he was in Gainesville with us. But I don't know that there's one particular race that stands out. I officiated NCAA championships in all the divisions. I was an alternate official in Los Angeles for the Olympic Games in '84. They're highlights to that degree. But for me, the sport's been very good to me. We've all kidded for years, all the Philly guys. I wouldn't have gone to college if I didn't have a scholarship. My dad couldn't have afforded to send me to college. And had I not gone to LaSalle, I probably never would have gone to the University of Florida. I don't know that I would have been a teacher and a coach and an official and an assigner and all those things. So I really do attribute a lot of that to running. I'll finish with this. So people have asked for years, well, why did you start that? How did you get into that, living where you live? when I was a freshman in high school, I was 4'10". I weighed 80 pounds. But I was a basketball fanatic. I mean, I could dribble, I could shoot, I could play, but I was 4'10". So the first day of school, my father called me over. My father's a typical old Irishman who spoke very little, but when he spoke, you listened. He says to me, Joe, today they're going to make an announcement, and they're going to say anybody interested in football, soccer, cross country, go there. He said, you go to that cross country thing. And I'm like, what is that, Dad? You don't just go. So I did, and I ran into this man who you knew well, big gruff guy. He's and I came home and I said, my father, I'm not going back there. He said, why not? I said, all this guy did was holler and scream at people. I said, I don't even know what this is. He said, that guy sends more people to college every year for cross country than anybody in this area. So we're going to buy you a pair of shoes, the old canvas Converse, no arch supports, no nothing, $5. He said, you're going to go there. I went in what we now call the wife beater T-shirts, sleeveless. And I was cross country at Cardinal Dougherty as a freshman and never stopped. And had I not done that, like I say, that part of it has really led me to all the things that have happened since then. You know, I have a great wife. I have 3 great kids, 5 grandkids, a couple of which can run. But, you know, that I really go back to the fact that had I not been involved in these sports, I don't know what I would have done other than that.
Well, Wendell, with that, Joe, I mean, of all my guests, I think I have the most in common with you because I grew up in Philly. I ran in the Catholic League.
Yep.
I ran, for Saint Clair. I coach now at Jefferson, which was Textile.
Yep.
I'm at Belmont. You were at Belmont, so I'm not following you, but, we do cross paths a lot. So.
Well, I could have a lot worse people following me than you, Dave Thomas. I can tell you that.
Well, good. Well, I want to thank Joe Ryan for being part of our show here. Just want to tell everyone out there who's watching, hopefully we'll cross our fingers that we have the Hall of Fame 5K race on August 29th. We're still waiting to hear from the city on that. And our induction ceremony. This year we have a lot of great ones going in. We have John Burns, who was a Catholic League, Villanova great, Ron Delaney, Kim Gallagher, Jen Rhines, and Paul Vandercryft, along with the 1971 LaSalle High School cross-country team that was coached by Tom Donnelly. So, we'll cross our fingers. If not, we'll have a delay, but we'll keep you in details and let you know. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Hall of Fame show.